When I initially watched this, it was at a theater only a few minutes away from my house. So I guess you can say I wasn't far from home. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment in my Spider-Man review series, where I review every single Spider-Man movie in the lead up to my review of No Way Home. And today we're talking about the last film we need to discuss, Spider-Man Far From Home. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's jump right into it, and let's talk about Spider-Man Far From Home. This once again stars Tom Holland as Peter Parker, who joins his best friends Ned, MJ, and the rest of the gang on a European vacation. However, Peter's plans to leave superheroes behind for a few weeks are quickly scrapped when he begrudgingly agrees to help Nick Fury uncover the mystery of several elemental creature attacks creating havoc across the continent. So before we go any further, as I've been doing with each of these reviews, this is going to go into spoiler territory. So if you haven't seen Far From Home and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. Jon Watts returns to direct this one, and while it's obviously not the final MCU film, it serves as the final film in what's known as the Infinity Saga, serving as something of an epilogue to Avengers Endgame. And I will say upfront that I've had something of a love-hate relationship with the movie. I go back and forth on it a lot. I like it, but the degree to which has varied a few times. Now, Avengers Endgame was the biggest movie of 2019, with a lot of hype surrounding it, years of build-up, feeling grand and epic in scale, and paying off 11 years worth of stories. MCU fans were clearly on a high after that one, and naturally, it would become such a hard act to follow, especially when going back to smaller scale and solo outings like this. And initially, when I saw this, I thought it was just fine. I had some issues with it, which I still hold, and we'll get into those later, but I thought maybe I initially was a bit harsher on this because of how much I enjoyed Endgame and thought less of anything that wasn't it. But then I watched it a few more times, and on the second viewing, well, after the high of Endgame wore off and I saw it with a different mindset, I came around to liking it even more. But as I've revisited this a few times, the issues I had in my head did keep coming back up. And even with the most recent viewing, the issues I initially had with it are still very noticeable, and I wound up going back and forth a lot on how much I really liked it, because those issues would take away from my enjoyment of the film on certain viewings, and we'll get into why in a bit. But what I will say, I think in the end, I've come around to this considerably more in the past year. I even included it in my favorite movie starring Samuel L. Jackson video, which I'll link to in case you missed it, but considering that, it gives you an idea where this is going. Now, despite its flaws, I will say I think it's another solid, entertaining entry in the MCU, and another enjoyable Spider-Man movie, even if this time around it's tied considerably more into the larger MCU and relies quite a lot on it. That's been the case with a number of MCU movies, but this one's one of the bigger solo movies where that connection runs very deep throughout this, and not just in the post-credits. I'd say this is much more of an MCU movie first, and a Spider-Man movie second, which goes back to a criticism people have had for Tom Holland's iteration of this character in general, because this starts off with showing us the first look of life after what's become known as the blip. And while in Endgame it was cool to see all our favorite heroes return through the portals coming to Captain America's aid, here we do actually get to see what it was like when people were returning. And I do like how they managed to take an event that was arguably one of the darkest and for some most traumatizing events within the MCU and still find a way to give it a bit of a humorous spin here. Like they're showing things such as band members appearing in the middle of a basketball game, and one of the kids mentions how his younger brother is now his older brother, plus jokes are made at other characters' expenses like Flash Thompson, who tries passing off as older than he is at one point. They found a good way of addressing it while maintaining a tone consistent with Homecoming and also still acknowledging the more emotional aspects of the blip, as we even get a small tribute to the Avengers who were lost by the Endgame finale. But from there, it's business as usual for Peter and his friends, serving as a nice continuation of the themes and dynamics set up in Homecoming, with the only major change being that MJ, played again by Zendaya, goes from being this snarky side character who's just suspicious of Peter to being his main love interest, though with still the same awkward deadpan sense of humor. And a lot of this film sees him trying to win her over while on the class trip while competing with a kid named Brad for her attention, and this effectively continues that teen comedy feel we got in Homecoming, which is something I'll give the MCU a lot of credit for. Now, I'm not one who loves every single movie or show in this franchise, but one thing I've been impressed by is the fact that the MCU as a whole has managed to maintain a solid tonal consistency with some slight deviations here and there, especially in the earlier days, and yet still incorporate all these different genres and styles and still make it all believable that it exists within the same universe. Everything from 70s political thrillers to martial arts movies to space epics to Shakespearean fantasy. For the most part, you can believe all these heroes who've had all these different adventures that fall under different genres can coexist in the same universe together. And here, we once again see that with the teen romantic comedy, and it works nicely. Now, while Tom Holland's Spider-Man films have been derided a bit for not being exactly the Spider-Man we know and love and not having as high of the emotional stakes as the older films, I have liked his take on the character, and especially enjoyed Homecoming for its light, breezy feel, while still incorporating some solid emotional beats. And this is a continuation of that style, especially in the first half, seeing the antics of Peter and his classmates play out under the guidance of Martin Starr and JB Smoove as their two quirky teachers/chaperones. Some of it can feel a bit sitcom-y, like we'll get montages of characters embarrassing themselves or being silly around one another, but a lot of the jokes landed, and what I will say is, coming off the heavier, more consequential Infinity War and Endgame, it was a nice change of pace to have something on where you can just sit back and smile. And Tom Holland is, as usual, a lot of fun as Peter. This once again sees him considerably more tied to Tony Stark this time around, as this is directly after his passing, and more on that momentarily, but as usual, he's very charming and funny, and he gets in a lot of fun one-liners, and he banters with the technology left to him by Stark, and he is just an absolute delight, as he has been with his other MCU appearances. And with her being moved to a much more prominent role, Zendaya is also a lot of fun here, doing a really solid job at injecting a lot of dry, sarcastic humor that's awkward but plays off Holland's awkwardness quite well. The romance subplot between them was actually very sweet. They get some really nice moments in the latter half of the movie, especially when the subject of his identity as Spider-Man comes up and the way she takes the news, which sees her be not that all surprised that she says she figured it out herself without him telling her, and it was another of the film's strongest elements. And I also enjoyed Jacob Batalon, who provided a lot of solid comedic relief as Ned, this time forming a brief romance with Betty Brand, played again by Andre Rice, which in and of itself is one long joke for how sudden it is and how they immediately act like they're soulmates. His sense of comedic timing was great. I think the buddy elements of the movie between him and Peter work nicely, and I laughed a lot during his scenes. Now, while all this is going on, we have this storyline involving Samuel L. Jackson returning as Nick Fury, which we find out in the post-credit sequence is actually not Fury, but the Skrull Talos from Captain Marvel, though for the sake of this review, I'll still refer to him as Fury. And he, along with Colby Smulders returning as Maria Hill, who's also a Skrull in disguise, recruit Peter to fight these forces known as the Elementals, with a man supposedly from the multiverse named Quentin Beck, aka Mysterio, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. Now, it's because of this storyline why I've gone so back and forth on this movie the amount of times I did. All the teen rom-com stuff is consistent all around, and a lot of fun, and it put a big smile on my face. On the other hand, this storyline, in my opinion, starts off extremely shaky, and while it gets much better in the latter half, and there are a number of things I actually do like about it, I find the buildup in the first half to be very frustrating at times. Now, I really do like Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio. He plays a great part that allows him to truly chew up the scenery, and it's always great getting more Samuel L. Jackson, and the banter among all these characters, especially between Jackson and Holland in the first half, was a lot of fun, filled with all the usual MCU humor, with Fury being frustrated by Peter's nonstop talking and antics. I think what bugged me about the storyline as a whole, though, was that it felt incredibly obvious something was up with Mysterio right from the start. Now, part of it is knowing that in general he is a Spider-Man villain in all other media, because the trailers, as well as the first half of the film, portray him as a hero, working alongside Fury and Spider-Man, and I always found that odd right from the get-go. Partially just due to the knowledge of him typically being portrayed as a villain, not that there wasn't always that chance that this could be a reimagined version of the character, similar to Venom in the Sony universe, but I think what essentially rubbed me the wrong way about him was the fact that his portrayal in this part of the film was that of someone with absolutely no flaws and of such fantastic moral standing. Like, I even remember how hard the trailers were pushing that he's supposedly a good guy here, and the way he's talked about is as if he can do absolutely no wrong. Plus, you never once see any sort of cutaways to this other world that Mysterio claimed he was from. No flashbacks, no scene of his world playing over him speaking about it. Nothing. And I know that's not a requirement when providing backstory for a character, but I know when an MCU movie is telling the truth about someone's past or their history, typically they show some cutaway, like Thanos talking about his world in Infinity War, or a lot of the history with Tony Stark's parents in Civil War, to name a few examples. On top of that, the elementals that he's seen fighting were just these giant CGI monsters that we only see very sparingly and would just roar and scream and not do much else. And I know the MCU has had issues before where their villains felt underdeveloped, but they at least had some sort of screen presence, even if they wind up not working. This kind of thrust you into things, and at times, things seemed way too clean cut with them, especially considering we barely explored these characters. So this seemed very suspicious right from the start that the movie's big villains would be generic CGI monsters that we only occasionally saw. And I mean, there's also always that chance that if you weren't familiar with Mysterio prior to seeing this movie, you might be totally fooled by all this. But I mean, Mysterio isn't exactly a fringe, obscure villain. This guy is one of the more popular Spider-Man villains who was part of the Sinister Six. And Spider-Man's villains, even if you never watched a lot of prior Spider-Man media, are all pretty well known. It just seemed odd that the movie tries pushing him as one of the film's protagonists when it seemed really obvious right from the get-go. And it made that first half awkward whenever it wasn't focused on the rom-com stuff. Now, when it got to that twist, there was still a bit of that awkwardness, but at least when we got it all out of the way, the film as a whole gets much, much better. Though the awkwardness in question, to be clear, is not only just this one long exposition dump where Mysterio's true intentions are all revealed in this one big speech, but also the fact that he's once again another villain in a Spider-Man movie who actually has more of a vendetta against Tony Stark, even though Tony Stark died saving half the universe in literally the MCU movie directly before this. Now, in a way, I get it, and I actually have less of a problem with this specific motivation than a lot of others do, because the idea also is that Beck is trying to take the mantle of savior in people's eyes, even though he's not a good guy. So it's not 100% just revenge against the dead guy, it's that he's also this narcissist himself who wants to be in the spotlight, and I get this was also meant to be this passing the torch movie now that Stark is dead and other heroes need to start taking up the mantle of the leader, and Spider-Man is getting teed up by Marvel to be one of the next big heroes front and center now that the Avengers are broken up. So this is meant to place more of an emphasis on that weighing on Peter's shoulders and dealing with all that while also dealing with this arrogant man. It's just the way it all comes off feels, like I said, awkward, and I just wish it found a better way to get that point across. But again, once we get past that awkward exposition dump, I think the movie gets considerably better, especially when it comes to its usage of Mysterio. Now that Jake Gyllenhaal can play Beck proper, now he really gets to chew up the scenery, and that's something Gyllenhaal has always been phenomenal with. He's an actor who knows how to go big and over the top, and he knows how to make something fun, without it ever coming off like he's trying too hard. And even though he's once again just a scorned ex-Stark employee bent on revenge, the way he plays into it reminds me of something almost akin to this mustache-twirling villain, the way he shouts orders and makes these grandiose statements that were very hammy but all in the right ways. Plus, he still found a way to add a lot more of legitimate tension to the film now that he starts going after Peter and his friends, and he makes it clear what he's willing to do to cover up his plans. So this is by far the better utilization of both the Mysterio character and Gyllenhaal himself. Also, the action scenes here were otherworldly. While I think Homecoming is the better film, the one area where I think this actually improved over Homecoming is the fight scenes, particularly the ones with Spider-Man facing off against Mysterio. Since Mysterio works heavily with creating illusions, this gives way to a number of fight scenes where he uses those drones that he operates to completely surround Peter in these trippy sequences that feel like a fever dream, where everyone and everything changes around him at such rapid-fire speeds. He'll have different people and objects change a number of different shapes before Peter can even process what he just saw. Despite the film as a whole not necessarily being one of my all-time favorite MCU movies, these fight scenes are among some of my favorite MCU moments. And the film finds some fun ways to shake up some of the dynamics, with Ned competing with MJ once she finds out Peter's identity for the spot of being Spider-Man's number 2, plus some of the funnier moments involve Happy Hogan, who Peter gets involved to save him when he realizes the danger his friends are in. We'll get a few brief instances of Happy getting a hold of Fury, but we get a lot of great laughs when MJ, Ned, Betty, and Flash all run into Happy and he attempts to protect them, only for for his jet to explode and they have to be on the run together. And now that all cards were on the table for all these characters, it allowed the rest of the movie to flourish and make for a much more satisfying conclusion that really elevated the movie past its noticeably rocky start. Though the victory is short-lived in the film's mid-credit sequence where Beck, before he dies, doctors footage of Spider-Man to make it look like he was the villain causing all the destruction in Europe while Mysterio was the hero, while also revealing Peter's identity, which is where No Way Home picks up. And in this mid-credit sequence, this sees the return of J.K. Simmons as a new version of J. Jonah Jameson, with the Daily Bugle reimagined as a conspiracy website. And I was very happy to see that, as honestly, no one can play the role better than him. And it took me totally by surprise when I first saw this that they'd even go down this route, which in comparison is now nothing compared to the amount of people they brought in for No Way Home, but it was very satisfying to see because, like I said in my reviews of the Raimi films, Simmons is just perfect casting. Spider-Man Far From Home has some noticeable issues, including a rocky first half and a bit of a clunky twist. However, it also has a lot that works about it, and it's one of those films where all the good considerably makes up for its more frustrating elements. Its teen romantic comedy vibe is a lot of fun, with the chemistry between Holland and Zendaya being very sweet. Plus, once it gets past its twist and the stakes begin increasing, it becomes a lot more consistent and enjoyable, thanks to some visually stunning action scenes and a hammy performance by Jake Gyllenhaal. And it ends on such a good note that it can make its faults a bit more forgivable, as well as making this another enjoyable entry in this franchise. Spider-Man Far From Home gets an 8 out of 10. I really do go back and forth on this one, but I think for now I'm going to lean towards something much more positive. The things I don't like about it are incredibly frustrating, but the things I really like about it make up a lot for that. So the second half especially pulls this up big time and makes this a lot of fun. But that's it. Stay tuned, as up next, we'll be discussing No Way Home. And in the meantime, let me know, did you see Far From Home, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did all the story elements flow for you? Do you like it more than Homecoming? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.